There are animals in the permafrost of Siberia that died 40,000 years ago and whose flesh is still red. Not fossilized, not mineralized, not compressed into rock over millions of years of geological time. Flesh, actual biological tissue, preserved by the cold with a completeness that has allowed scientists to extract intact proteins, to analyze the contents of the stomach, to find undigested buttercups and grasses still visible between the teeth. Woolly mammoths, the great shaggy elephants of the Pleistocene, the animals that shared the world with the first anatomically modern humans, that were painted on the walls of French caves with a naturalistic precision that suggests their painters had spent long hours observing living individuals, died in such numbers, in such conditions, that tens of thousands of their bodies are still locked in the frozen ground of Siberia and Alaska. The permafrost has kept them. The cold has preserved what the Earth would normally have consumed. And the result is that we can examine animals that lived in the Ice Age not only as bones and fossils but as bodies, three-dimensional, biological, still carrying within them the evidence of what they were doing in the last hours of their lives. Subscribe now and never miss a documentary. Every week we travel into the evidence that the conventional record has not fully explained, into the moments when the Earth story turns strange and the answers that science offers are more unsettling than the questions they resolve. The mammoth that generated perhaps the most discussion among paleontologists was discovered in 1900 by a Siberian hunter named Semyon Terabykhin on the banks of the Berezovka River in northeastern Siberia. The animal was so well preserved that the dogs accompanying the discovery party began eating it before the scientific expedition could arrive. What the scientists found when they reached the site was a male woolly mammoth, partially exposed from the permafrost, with intact muscles, skin, and hair, and with the remains of its last meal preserved in its mouth and stomach. The contents of the stomach included grasses, sedges, and flowering plants, the vegetation of a summer or early autumn meadow. The animal appeared to have died suddenly, in the middle of eating, without the kind of gradual decline that would characterize death from starvation or disease. The position of the body suggested violent impact. Several bones were broken, including the pelvis and the right foreleg, in a pattern consistent with a fall into a crevasse or a sudden collapse of ground beneath the animal. But the question of why an otherwise healthy adult male mammoth had fallen into a frozen crevasse, and why the temperatures that preserved it had acted so quickly, was a question that the Berezovka specimen raised without answering. Tonight we follow the evidence for one of the most debated extinctions in the history of the Earth, the disappearance, within the past 12,000 years, of the woolly mammoth and dozens of other large animals that had dominated the landscapes of the Pleistocene for hundreds of thousands of years. It is a mystery that has not been solved, despite more than a century of intensive research, and the competing explanations that scientists have advanced are as fascinating and as troubling as the extinction itself. The permafrost of Siberia and Alaska currently contains the remains of millions of mammoths. The scale of the mammoth fauna that once inhabited the North is difficult to fully appreciate. Estimates based on the density of mammoth remains in permafrost deposits suggest that the Siberian permafrost alone may contain the remains of 10 million or more woolly mammoths, accumulated over the hundreds of thousands of years during which the species flourished. They are everywhere in the Arctic permafrost: bones, teeth, tusks eroding out of riverbanks, cliffs, and coastal bluffs with every spring thaw. In Russia, the ivory trade in mammoth tusks is a significant industry. Tens of thousands of kilograms of mammoth ivory are exported annually, recovered from permafrost exposures across Siberia, providing an alternative to elephant ivory that is technically legal and that fuels a commercial enterprise built on the frozen remains of an extinct species. The mammoths are still being found, still eroding from the ground, still yielding their secrets to a science that is only now developing the tools to fully interpret what they contain. The contrast between the scale of the mammoth's existence, millions of animals, hundreds of thousands of years, an entire continent shaped by their presence, and the speed and completeness of their disappearance is what makes their extinction so striking. Whatever happened to the woolly mammoth happened fast, relative to the geological timescales on which such things are usually measured. The permafrost records their abundance. The absence of their descendants records the finality of their end. And in the gap between those two facts, between the abundance and the absence, lies the question that this documentary pursues. The woolly mammoth, Mammothus primigenius, was not a primitive or fragile animal. It was a highly specialized, superbly adapted megafaunal species that had evolved over several million years to thrive in the cold, dry grasslands of the Pleistocene northern hemisphere, the Mammoth steppe, as paleontologists call it, one of the most extensive terrestrial ecosystems the Earth has ever produced. At its maximum extent, the Mammoth steppe stretched from the British Isles in the west to the Yukon in the east, covering much of the northern hemisphere in a continuous band of cold, productive grassland. It was a landscape very different from the tundra and boreal forest that occupies those latitudes today. Drier, colder in winter, but highly productive in summer, supporting biomass densities comparable to the African savanna at its most productive. The woolly mammoth was the dominant large herbivore of this ecosystem, comparable in ecological role to the African elephant in the modern savanna. It shaped the landscape through its feeding and trampling, maintaining the open grassland structure that the Mammoth steppe required, and it was the prey upon which many of the apex predators of the Pleistocene depended. The mammoth itself was a formidable animal. Adult males reached shoulder heights of up to 3.5 meters, slightly smaller than the largest modern African elephants, and weights of up to 6 tons. Their tusks, which could reach lengths of over 4 meters in old males, were used for scraping snow and ice to reach the vegetation beneath, for stripping bark from trees, and probably for combat with rivals. Their coat consisted of 2 layers, a dense undercoat of fine wool and an outer coat of long guard hairs that could reach lengths of up to a meter, providing insulation against temperatures that regularly fell below -40 degrees Celsius. Their ears were small, reducing heat loss. Their tails were short, again minimizing exposure. Every feature of the animal's anatomy reflects the extreme cold of the environment for which it had evolved. The woolly mammoth was not alone in its world. The Pleistocene megafauna, the large animals of the Ice Age, included a remarkable diversity of species that are now entirely extinct. In North America alone, the end of the Pleistocene saw the disappearance of mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, glyptodonts, short-faced bears, American lions, American cheetahs, dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, horses, camels, and tapirs. In Eurasia, the losses included woolly rhinoceroses, cave lions, cave hyenas, giant deer, and the woolly mammoth. In Australia, an even earlier extinction event had already eliminated the continent's megafauna, including giant wombats, enormous kangaroos, and the fearsome thylacoleo, a marsupial lion. The scale and geographic breadth of these extinctions, affecting multiple continents, multiple orders of mammals, animals that had survived multiple previous ice ages, demand an explanation that goes beyond the routine background extinction rate that characterizes normal geological time. The woolly rhinoceros deserves particular mention as a companion species to the mammoth whose extinction raises similar puzzles. Coelodonta antiquitatis, the woolly rhinoceros, was a formidable animal, comparable in size to the white rhinoceros of modern Africa, covered in a dense coat of reddish-brown hair, and equipped with a massive front horn that could reach lengths of over a meter. Like the mammoth, it was a characteristic animal of the Mammoth steppe, an animal adapted to the cold, dry grasslands of the Pleistocene northern hemisphere, and like the mammoth, it disappeared in the late Pleistocene in association with the same combination of climate change and human arrival that drove the mammoth to extinction. Frozen woolly rhinoceros specimens have been found in Siberian permafrost, providing the same kind of soft tissue preservation that makes the mammoth specimens so remarkable, and the genetics of the woolly rhinoceros have been partially reconstructed from ancient DNA. The woolly rhinoceros was the last of the rhinoceros lineage that had been dominant in Eurasia for millions of years, and its disappearance ended a dynasty that had shaped the grasslands of the northern hemisphere since the Miocene. Its extinction, like the mammoths, is a loss that is difficult to fully appreciate from a world in which it is absent. The giant ground sloths of the Americas were another category of Pleistocene giant that vanished in association with the arrival of human hunters. Megatherium americanum, the largest of the ground sloths, was an animal the size of a modern elephant, a slow-moving, formidable herbivore that stood on its hind legs to reach vegetation high in trees, using massive claws that could also serve as weapons against predators. Ground sloth dung preserved in dry caves of the American Southwest has been radiocarbon dated to within a few thousand years of the arrival of the first human hunters, providing some of the most direct temporal evidence for the relationship between human arrival and megafaunal extinction. When the ground sloths disappeared from North America shortly after the arrival of the Clovis culture, they left behind a continent transformed. Forests that had been shaped by their browsing suddenly free of their most significant large herbivore, ecosystems reorganizing in the absence of animals that had been central to them for millions of years. The first serious scientific framework for explaining the Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions was developed in the 19th century, when the geological and paleontological evidence for their reality was first being assembled, and it pointed to climate change as the primary driver. The logic was straightforward. The end of the Pleistocene was also the end of the last ice age, and the dramatic warming and environmental change that accompanied the transition from glacial to interglacial conditions would have been highly disruptive to the cold-adapted megafauna of the northern hemisphere. The woolly mammoth's habitat, the cold, dry mammoth steppe, was transformed by the warming. The grasslands gave way to the wetter, less productive tundra and boreal forest that now covers the same latitudes. The dense, nutritious grasses that had supported the enormous biomass of the Pleistocene megafauna were replaced by mosses, lichens, and sedges that provided far fewer calories per hectare. The animals that had evolved for the mammoth steppe were, in this view, simply victims of a habitat that had disappeared from beneath them. The climate change hypothesis has strong supporting evidence. The timing of the megafaunal extinctions broadly correlates with the climatic transitions of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. The woolly mammoth's range contracted as the climate warmed, retreating northward and eventually being confined to refuge populations on Arctic islands where the mammoth steppe persisted longest. The last known woolly mammoths on Earth lived on Wrangel Island in the Russian Arctic, where a small population survived until approximately 4,000 years ago, long after the mainland populations had disappeared, and precisely because Wrangel Island maintained a version of the mammoth steppe habitat while the rest of the northern hemisphere had been transformed. But the climate change hypothesis, while not wrong, has significant weaknesses that prevent it from serving as a complete explanation. The most important is that the Pleistocene had experienced many previous glacial-interglacial transitions, approximately 20 major cycles over the past 2 million years, and none of them had produced megafaunal extinctions on the scale of the terminal Pleistocene event. The woolly mammoth had survived the Eemian interglacial, approximately 120,000 years ago, which was actually warmer than the current interglacial. It had survived multiple previous cycles of warming, habitat change, and range contraction. Why should the most recent warming have been uniquely lethal when so many previous ones had not been? The climate alone, in other words, was probably not sufficient to explain what happened. Something else was present at the end of the Pleistocene that had not been present during the previous warming cycles, and that something was us. The timing argument against the climate-only hypothesis can be made more specific by looking at the detailed sequence of events in specific regions. In Siberia, where the mammoth fossil record is richest, the decline of the mammoth population preceded the most dramatic phase of the Holocene warming by several thousand years, suggesting that climate alone, at least in its direct effects on habitat, cannot explain the timing of the extinction. In the British Isles, mammoths persisted through the last glacial maximum, the coldest period of the Ice Age, when conditions were far more extreme than anything the warming Holocene produced, and then disappeared during the warming, but not until human populations had expanded into the region. The correlation between human expansion and mammoth decline, in region after region, is difficult to explain as coincidence. The climate change hypothesis also struggles to explain the selectivity of the extinctions. Why should the warming have eliminated the woolly mammoth, the woolly rhinoceros, and the cave lion while leaving intact species like the reindeer, the muskox, and the Arctic fox, all animals that were equally specialized for cold conditions and that faced the same habitat loss from the warming? The selective pattern of the extinctions, eliminating primarily the largest species, the slowest reproducing species, the species whose population growth rates were lowest, is exactly the pattern that selective hunting would produce, because those are precisely the species that are most vulnerable to even modest levels of additional mortality. A species that produces only one offspring every 5 years, as elephants do, cannot sustain heavy hunting pressure the way a species that produces a litter of 6 offspring per year can. The selectivity of the Pleistocene extinctions is a fingerprint that points more toward hunting pressure than toward climate change as the primary driver. The timing of the extinctions in specific regions provides additional evidence that climate alone cannot explain what happened. In North America, the arrival of the Clovis culture and the disappearance of the megafauna are separated by at most a few thousand years, in some analyses, by less than 1,000 years, a period so short that it is difficult to attribute the extinctions to the gradual accumulation of climate-driven habitat change. In contrast, regions of the world that have been inhabited by anatomically modern humans for much longer periods before the late Pleistocene extinctions, Sub-Saharan Africa, South and Southeast Asia, show much lower rates of megafaunal extinction during the same period. The correlation between the recency of human arrival and the severity of megafaunal extinction holds across the globe with a consistency that is difficult to explain without invoking human hunting as a major causal factor. The human hunting hypothesis, the idea that prehistoric hunters played a decisive or even primary role in the Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions, was first systematically developed by the American paleoecologist Paul Martin in the 1960s and 1970s, and it remains one of the most debated propositions in the history of paleontology. Martin's argument was elegant and disturbing. He noted that the timing and geography of the megafaunal extinctions matched with remarkable precision the timing and geography of the arrival of human hunters in previously uninhabited or sparsely inhabited regions. In North America, where the extinctions were particularly complete, nearly all of the continent's megafauna disappeared within a geologically brief period. The timing coincided with the arrival of the Clovis culture, the earliest well-documented hunter-gatherers of the Americas, approximately 13,000 years ago. In Australia, the extinctions occurred earlier, around 40 to 50,000 years ago, coinciding with the arrival of the first anatomically modern humans on the continent. In Madagascar and New Zealand, the extinctions occurred much later, within the past 2,000 years, but again in close temporal association with the arrival of human settlers on those islands. The pattern suggested to Martin a process he called the overkill hypothesis, that human hunters, arriving in regions where the megafauna had evolved without experience of bipedal predators, encountered animals that had no fear of humans and could be hunted to extinction before they had time to develop the wariness that would have allowed them to survive. The mathematics of the overkill scenario, which Martin modeled extensively, suggested that a relatively small group of hunters with effective weapons could drive large, slow-reproducing animals to extinction within a few centuries, far too quickly for the animals to adapt behaviorally or for the ecosystem to reach a new equilibrium. The overkill hypothesis was controversial from the moment of its publication, and it remains so. The archaeological evidence for massive human hunting of mammoths is actually quite sparse. There are only a handful of sites in North America where mammoth bones are found in clear association with Clovis artifacts, and most of those sites are ambiguous about whether the mammoths were hunted or scavenged. Critics of the overkill hypothesis point out that the Clovis people were not uniquely powerful hunters. They had the same stone tools as many other prehistoric populations, and that there is no direct archaeological evidence for the kind of wholesale slaughter that the overkill model requires. The absence of kill sites, they argue, is strong evidence against the hypothesis. Defenders of the overkill hypothesis respond that the absence of kill sites is exactly what the model predicts. If the extinction happened within a few centuries, the probability of finding the specific sites where the killing occurred is very low, because the window of time during which the kills happened is narrow and the preservation conditions for organic material in most of North America are poor. The debate has been conducted with considerable intensity for more than 5 decades, and it has not reached a resolution that satisfies all parties. The Clovis culture itself, the culture associated with the earliest well-documented human occupation of North America, adds another layer of complexity to the story. Clovis points, the distinctive fluted stone projectile points that identify the culture, have been found at mammoth kill sites in the American Southwest and Great Plains, but the number of such sites is small, fewer than a dozen well-documented examples, against a background of millions of mammoths that once inhabited the continent. Either the Clovis people were extremely selective hunters who targeted mammoths but rarely, leaving few kill sites, or they were primarily hunters of other prey who occasionally killed mammoths, or they encountered mammoths that were already in serious decline from other causes and added only the final pressure to a population already heading toward extinction. None of these interpretations is fully consistent with all the evidence, and the ambiguity of the archaeological record has allowed both sides of the overkill debate to claim partial support. What is clear is that the first Americans encountered a continent whose megafauna had no previous experience of bipedal hunters using projectile weapons. The proboscideans of Africa, the ancestors of the modern elephant, had co-evolved with hominid hunters for millions of years and had developed the behavioral wariness that makes modern elephants so difficult to approach without detection. The American mastodons and mammoths had no such experience. They were, in the words of one paleontologist, ecologically naive, animals that had never learned to fear the specific predator that was now pursuing them. Whether that naivety was their primary vulnerability or merely one factor among several remains the central question of the overkill debate. The evidence from Siberia, where the mammoth specimens are best preserved and the fossil record most detailed, paints a picture of the mammoth's decline that is more nuanced and more troubling than either the climate change or the overkill hypothesis alone can explain. Ancient DNA analysis of woolly mammoth specimens from across the range of the species has allowed scientists to reconstruct the population genetics of the mammoth over the past 100,000 years with remarkable detail. The results reveal a story of repeated population crashes and recoveries that tracks closely with the climate cycles of the late Pleistocene. Periods of warming drove the mammoth population into fragmented refugia, where genetic diversity declined, and subsequent coolings allowed the population to expand again and recover its diversity. The mammoth was, in other words, no stranger to environmental stress and near collapse. It had been through this cycle many times before. What the genetic evidence shows for the final extinction event is different. The last decline of the mainland mammoth population, between approximately 20,000 and 10,000 years ago, shows a pattern of genetic impoverishment, a loss of genetic diversity, that is more severe than previous decline episodes, and that was not followed by the recovery seen after previous warming events. The population became increasingly isolated in small refugia, inbreeding increased, and the deleterious mutations that accumulate in small isolated populations began to build up at rates that would have compromised the health and reproductive success of the animals. By the time the warming of the early Holocene was complete, the mammoth population on the mainland was already severely compromised, genetically weakened, fragmented into small isolated groups, and unable to recolonize the new habitats that the changing climate was creating. Into that already stressed population, human hunters arrived. The evidence from the genetics is consistent with a scenario in which climate change weakened the mammoth population to a point where it could no longer sustain the pressure of even modest levels of human predation, where the combination of genetic stress, habitat loss, and hunting produced a synergistic collapse that neither factor alone would have caused. This combination hypothesis, that the megafaunal extinctions resulted from the interaction of climate change and human hunting, with each factor amplifying the effects of the other, is now the most widely accepted view among paleontologists, though the relative contributions of the two factors remain debated. The implications of the combination hypothesis are significant. They suggest that the mammoth's extinction was not simply an accident of timing, the bad luck of living in a place that was warming when humans arrived. It suggests instead that the mammoth was in a vulnerable state, struggling with the challenges that all previous warming cycles had posed, and that the additional pressure of human hunters was enough to push it over the edge from decline into extinction. The last mammoths were not killed by a single event. They were worn down by a world that was changing too fast in too many directions at once. The evidence for the combination hypothesis is also supported by what happened in different parts of the world at different times. In Africa, where humans and megafauna had co-evolved for the longest period, the losses were smallest. Only about 35% of megafaunal genera, compared to over 70% in North America and almost 90% in Australia. In Eurasia, the losses were intermediate, roughly consistent with a continent where humans had been present for tens of thousands of years before the terminal Pleistocene extinctions, giving the megafauna somewhat more time to develop wariness. The gradient of extinction severity tracks the gradient of human prehistory in each region, with the greatest losses where humans were newest and the smallest losses where humans were oldest. That gradient is the combination hypothesis's strongest argument. It explains why the same climate change that was occurring globally produced such dramatically different extinction rates in different regions, by reference to the presence or absence and the duration of exposure of human hunting pressure. The specific role of fire in the Pleistocene extinctions has received increasing attention from researchers in recent decades. Anatomically, modern humans were the most effective fire-using species that had ever existed, and there is evidence that the arrival of humans in previously unoccupied regions was associated with dramatically increased fire frequency, visible in the charcoal record preserved in lake sediments and peat deposits. In Australia, the arrival of humans approximately 50,000 years ago coincides with a marked increase in fire frequency that transformed much of the continent's vegetation from fire-sensitive woodland to fire-adapted scrubland. That transformation of habitat, driven by human fire use, may have been as important as direct hunting in eliminating the megafauna, destroying the vegetation communities that supported the large browsers and grazers, fragmenting their populations into isolated refugia, and reducing the carrying capacity of the landscape below what was needed to sustain viable populations of slow-reproducing megafaunal species. The frozen mammoth specimens of Siberia have provided evidence that goes beyond genetics and into the immediate circumstances of individual deaths, and some of what they have revealed is deeply puzzling. The Beresovka mammoth was not unique in showing signs of sudden, violent death. Several other Siberian mammoth specimens have been found in positions suggesting rapid burial. Animals that appear to have been caught in conditions that killed them quickly and preserved them before decomposition could proceed. The temperatures required to freeze a large animal rapidly enough to preserve its soft tissues are extreme, well below -30 degrees Celsius, sustained for an extended period, and the question of how those conditions came about has generated speculation ranging from the scientifically mainstream to the genuinely extraordinary. The mainstream explanation is that the Siberian permafrost specimens were preserved by falling into natural freezing conditions, crevasses in ice, frozen lakes, or peat bogs, and that the preservation of soft tissue, while remarkable from the perspective of the paleontological record, does not require any special catastrophic event. Animals die in all kinds of circumstances, and those that die in the right conditions get preserved. Those that don't. The specimens that have attracted most attention are precisely the ones that preserve the most detail, and the detail they preserve reflects the specific circumstances of their individual deaths rather than any general catastrophic event. A minority scientific hypothesis, associated primarily with researchers studying the late Pleistocene extinction more broadly, has proposed that the frozen mammoth specimens are evidence of a more dramatic event, a rapid cooling episode or a catastrophic flooding event that froze large numbers of animals simultaneously and rapidly. The presence of undigested food in the stomachs of several specimens, vegetation that would have been summer or early autumn growth, suggesting the animals died in warm weather, combined with the very cold conditions required to preserve them, has been taken as evidence that the freezing happened very suddenly, in weather conditions that changed catastrophically within hours or days rather than gradually over seasons. The image that has sometimes been proposed, of herds of mammoths flash frozen by some sudden climatic catastrophe, is vivid and dramatic, but the evidence for it is contested. Most paleontologists believe that the apparent contradiction between the warm weather stomach contents and the cold preservation conditions can be explained by the animals dying in late autumn or early winter, when the vegetation of the previous summer was still available in the mouth and digestive tract while the temperatures had already dropped below freezing. The Yukagir mammoth, discovered in 1977 in excellent condition in the Siberian permafrost, showed a remarkable level of preservation. Intact skin, intact hair, intact internal organs, and a preserved brain. Analysis of its DNA contributed significantly to the genetic picture of mammoth population history described earlier. But it also revealed something unexpected. The animal had been severely malnourished at the time of its death. Its bone marrow had been replaced by a gelatinous substance characteristic of starvation in large mammals. It had died not from sudden catastrophe but from slow deprivation, from a landscape that was no longer providing adequate food to sustain it. That malnourishment tells us something important about the mammoth's decline. A landscape that could no longer sustain adult mammoths would reduce not just adult survival but reproductive success. Stressed, malnourished females produce fewer offspring and provide less milk to calves. The slow starvation in the Yukagir mammoth's bone marrow is a window into the population dynamics of a species in decline. Individual animals struggling to find adequate food in a landscape changing faster than they could track. The question of how mammoths responded behaviorally to those changes is one that the study of modern elephant behavior helps us partially infer. Modern elephants have long-term spatial memories that allow them to navigate to water sources and food patches visited only a few times over decades. Old matriarchs are particularly valuable repositories of this geographic knowledge. They remember resource locations that younger elephants have never visited, and their leadership is crucial during droughts and environmental stresses. A population of mammoths experiencing habitat loss would depend critically on older females to navigate to diminishing resources. The loss of those older females to hunters or to starvation would deprive the remaining herd of the navigational and social knowledge needed to survive in an increasingly unfamiliar and resource-poor landscape. The extinction of the mammoth may have been, in part, an extinction of knowledge, the accumulated geographic and social wisdom of matriarchal lineages, lost when the individuals who carried it died. The pattern of body condition in the frozen Siberian specimens reflects this dynamic directly. Animals in excellent nutritional condition represent individuals that died suddenly, before starvation could set in. Animals in poor condition, like the Yukagir mammoth with its gelatinous bone marrow, had been suffering for weeks or months before death. The mix of well-nourished and malnourished individuals suggests a population experiencing variable conditions, some animals finding adequate food, others unable to, exactly what you would expect if older, more experienced animals who knew where to find food were being selectively removed by hunters, leaving younger animals to navigate a landscape they did not fully know. In 2007, a Siberian reindeer herder named Yuri Kudi discovered the most complete and best-preserved woolly mammoth specimen ever found, a baby female, approximately 1 month old at the time of her death, lying in the permafrost of the Yamal Peninsula in northwestern Siberia. The calf was named Luba, after Kudi's wife. She was approximately 85 centimeters tall and 130 centimeters long, about the size of a large domestic pig, and she was preserved with a completeness that exceeded any previously known mammoth specimen. Her eyes were intact. Her trunk was intact. Her skin was intact, with the fine downy hair of a mammoth infant still visible. She still had her milk teeth, which had not yet erupted through the gums, suggesting she had died very young indeed. CT scanning of her body revealed intact internal organs, lungs, liver, heart, all preserved in their correct anatomical positions. Traces of her mother's milk were found in her digestive tract, confirming her very young age. And the precise cause of her death was visible in her respiratory tract. Her lungs and trachea contained mud, suggesting she had drowned, probably by falling into a riverbank mud trap and being unable to extricate herself. Luba is now housed at the Shemenovsky Museum in Salekhard in northwestern Russia, and she has been studied by researchers from institutions around the world. The analysis of her DNA contributed to the genetic portrait of the late Pleistocene mammoth population. The analysis of the isotopes in her tissues provided information about the diet of nursing mammoth mothers in the late Pleistocene. The preservation of her internal organs allowed comparison with modern elephant anatomy that is not possible with any other mammoth specimen. She is, in the most literal sense, a window into the Ice Age, an individual animal with a specific face and a specific life history that can be studied in a way that bones and fossils cannot permit. The encounter with Luba in particular, with the specific face of a specific infant mammoth, preserved well enough that you can see the texture of her skin and the fineness of her infant hair, produces an emotional response that is different in kind from the response to bones or fossils. The Pleistocene, which in its geological dimensions feels remote and impersonal, suddenly acquires a human scale when confronted with the preserved body of a month-old baby. She died before she had a chance to learn much about the world. Her mother was nearby, presumably died nearby, perhaps when the bank into which Luba fell continued to collapse, and the herd that the two of them belonged to continued its journey without them, across a landscape that no longer exists, toward a future that would not include their descendants. The entire story of the mammoth's extinction is contained, in miniature, in the specific tragedy of Luba's death. A single individual, in a single moment, at the beginning of the long process of disappearance that would eventually eliminate every mammoth from the earth. The existence of specimens like Luba raises a question that goes beyond the scientific. What does it mean to find the body of an individual animal that lived 40,000 years ago, preserved well enough that you can see its face? There is something different about the experience of looking at a preserved animal, the direct encounter with a once-living individual, that looking at bones or reconstructed skeletons does not provide. The mammoth becomes not an abstraction, not a category of extinct megafauna, but a specific being that was alive, that nursed and was nursed, that had a mother and a family group and a place in an ecosystem that no longer exists. The emotional weight of that specificity is one reason why the mammoth's extinction feels different from the extinction of most prehistoric animals, why it carries a moral charge that the disappearance of, say, a species of Cambrian trilobite does not. The mammoths were our contemporaries. Some of them may have been seen by ancestors of people alive today, and their preservation in the permafrost gives them a face. The encounter with Luba in particular, with the specific face of a specific infant mammoth, preserved well enough that you can see the texture of her skin and the fineness of her infant hair, produces an emotional response that is different in kind from the response to bones or fossils. The Pleistocene, which in its geological dimensions feels remote and impersonal, suddenly acquires a human scale when confronted with the preserved body of a month-old baby. She died before she had a chance to learn much about the world. Her mother was nearby, presumably died nearby, perhaps when the bank into which Luba fell continued to collapse, and the herd that the two of them belonged to continued its journey without them, across a landscape that no longer exists, toward a future that would not include their descendants. The entire story of the mammoth's extinction is contained, in miniature, in the specific tragedy of Luba's death. A single individual, in a single moment, at the beginning of the long process of disappearance that would eventually eliminate every mammoth from the Earth. Several other baby mammoth specimens have been found in Siberian permafrost since Luba's discovery. Chroma, found in 2008, was approximately 2 months old with intact brain tissue. Yucca, found in 2010, was a juvenile of 6 to 9 years whose remains showed cut marks suggesting human butchering and bite marks suggesting predator scavenging, direct physical evidence of the kind of human-mammoth interaction that the overkill hypothesis proposes as a major driver of extinction. Each new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, and the puzzle becomes more detailed and more complex with each addition. The Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt and dramatic cooling that interrupted the gradual warming of the post-glacial world approximately 12,900 years ago and lasted for approximately 1,200 years, is one of the most intensely studied events in quaternary climate science, and its relationship to the megafaunal extinctions is one of the most contentious questions in the field. The Younger Dryas is documented in ice core records, ocean sediment records, and terrestrial palynological records from across the northern hemisphere as a sudden return to near-glacial conditions that occurred within the space of a few decades, possibly within a single decade, according to the most detailed ice core analyses. Average temperatures in Greenland fell by approximately 10 degrees Celsius within a century. The ice sheets, which had been retreating, halted and in some cases re-advanced. The forest and grassland communities that had been expanding northward with the warming were pushed back south. And the Younger Dryas cooling coincides, in the North American record, with the end of the Clovis culture and the disappearance of several of the megafaunal species that had survived into the warming period. The cause of the Younger Dryas has been debated extensively. The mainstream hypothesis, which has substantial support from oceanographic and geological evidence, proposes that the cooling was triggered by a massive pulse of freshwater from the melting Laurentide ice sheet into the North Atlantic, a flood of cold, fresh meltwater that disrupted the thermohaline circulation of the Atlantic Ocean, reducing the northward transport of warm water that keeps the North Atlantic region warmer than its latitude would otherwise warrant. The source of this meltwater pulse has been identified as Lake Agassiz, an enormous glacial lake in the interior of North America that may have drained catastrophically into the North Atlantic through the St. Lawrence or the Mackenzie River systems. A more controversial hypothesis, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, first formally proposed in 2007 by a team led by the geologist James Kennett, proposes that the Younger Dryas cooling was triggered not by a meltwater pulse but by the impact or airburst of a comet or asteroid that struck or exploded over the Laurentide ice sheet at the beginning of the Younger Dryas. The hypothesis was motivated by the discovery, in sediment layers dating to approximately 12,900 years ago, of a suite of markers that the proponents argued were evidence of a cosmic impact: nanodiamonds, spherules of melted glass, iridium anomalies, and magnetic particles concentrated in a thin layer at the Younger Dryas boundary horizon at sites across North America, Europe, and the Middle East. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis has attracted particularly intense interest among researchers interested in its potential connection to the megafaunal extinctions and to the oral traditions of indigenous peoples across North America. Several researchers have proposed that the traditions of catastrophic fire and flood that appear in the oral literature of many Native American nations may preserve cultural memories of the Younger Dryas impact event, that the stories of a great conflagration that destroyed the world and was survived only by a small number of people or animals represent a genuine historical memory, transmitted across more than 12,000 years of oral tradition, of the fires that swept North America when the comet struck. This proposal is inherently difficult to evaluate. Oral traditions do sometimes preserve memories of real historical events, as the study of indigenous accounts of volcanic eruptions, floods, and other geological events has demonstrated in various cases. But the attribution of specific oral traditions to specific historical events 12,000 years ago requires a level of continuity and accuracy of transmission that cannot be demonstrated. The Younger Dryas itself, whatever its cause, was one of the most abrupt and dramatic climatic events of the late Quaternary, and its effects on the megafauna would have been significant regardless of whether a cosmic impact was involved. The sudden return to near-glacial conditions would have eliminated the warm season vegetation that the surviving megafauna depended on, fragmented the populations that were already under stress from the earlier phase of warming, and potentially driven species that were already at critically low population sizes below the minimum viable population threshold. The Younger Dryas was, in the context of the megafaunal extinctions, a compounding stress, adding a new and sudden climatic disruption to populations that were already struggling with the longer-term changes of the post-glacial transition. The end of the Younger Dryas, approximately 11,700 years ago, was as abrupt as its beginning. Ice core records show that temperatures in Greenland rose by approximately 10 degrees Celsius within a decade or two, one of the most rapid warming events in the geological record. The vegetation communities that had retreated southward during the Younger Dryas were suddenly released from the cold, and the landscape of the northern hemisphere transformed rapidly. For the megafauna that had survived both the initial warming and the Younger Dryas cold snap, this final warming was the last challenge. The mammoths tracked across the shifting landscape by human hunters for thousands of years were now caught between a habitat disappearing beneath them and a predator that had grown increasingly sophisticated. The end was not sudden. It was the accumulation of 1,000 small failures, played out across what had once been the mammoth steppe. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis generated immediate and intense controversy, and it remains one of the most disputed propositions in quaternary science, producing a debate that illuminates not only the question of what killed the mammoths but the broader question of how science handles extraordinary claims supported by ambiguous evidence. The hypothesis was attractive for several reasons. It offered a single catastrophic event that could simultaneously explain the Younger Dryas cooling, the extinction of the Clovis culture, and the disappearance of the North American megafauna, a unified narrative that connected events that had previously been explained by separate mechanisms. The proposed impact was large enough, the proponents argued, to have caused massive wildfires across North America, documented in the charcoal record at the Younger Dryas boundary, that would have dramatically accelerated the megafaunal extinctions by destroying habitat and disrupting food chains in addition to killing animals directly. The evidence presented in support of the hypothesis was, however, strongly contested by other researchers who attempted to replicate the original findings. Several independent research groups examined the proposed impact markers, the nanodiamonds, the spherules, the iridium anomalies, and found either that they could not replicate the original results or that the markers could be explained by non-impact processes. The presence of magnetic spherules, for example, which the impact hypothesis proponents cited as evidence of cosmic material, has been documented in sediments from many different time periods and is now understood to reflect normal deposition of cosmic dust rather than a specific impact event. The nanodiamonds, which are the most distinctive proposed marker, have been found by some researchers and not by others in the same sediment layers, raising questions about methodology and interpretation. A major review paper published in 2018, examining all the evidence then available, concluded that the impact hypothesis was not supported by the evidence, that the proposed markers were either not real, not concentrated at the Younger Dryas boundary, or explicable by non-impact processes. The proponents of the impact hypothesis have pushed back against these criticisms, arguing that the methodology of the critical studies was flawed and that new evidence continues to accumulate. The debate remains active and unresolved, and it has taken on a character that goes beyond the normal give and take of scientific disagreement, with personal attacks, allegations of data manipulation, and the kind of entrenchment that sometimes afflicts controversies in which the stakes feel very high. What the debate illustrates is that extraordinary claims, even when they generate genuine scientific interest and produce legitimate empirical research, require a very high standard of evidence to gain acceptance, and that the standard is appropriately high, because the history of science is full of dramatic hypotheses that attracted attention and ultimately failed to survive scrutiny. The most recent major review of the Younger Dryas impact evidence, published in 2023, found that while some of the proposed markers, particularly certain types of platinum group element anomalies, are real and difficult to explain by entirely mundane processes, the overall evidence does not yet meet the bar required to confirm a large cosmic impact event. The platinum anomalies in particular are intriguing, because platinum group elements are enriched in extraterrestrial material, and their concentration at the Younger Dryas boundary at multiple sites around the world is difficult to explain without invoking some kind of cosmic input. Whether that cosmic input represents a major impact capable of triggering the Younger Dryas cooling, or a more modest influx of cosmic dust from a comet that broke up at some distance from the Earth, or something else entirely, remains genuinely uncertain. The impact hypothesis, in other words, has not been killed. It has been significantly constrained, with the most dramatic versions of the scenario no longer tenable, but with some residual signal in the data that continues to resist entirely mundane explanation. For the question of the mammoth extinctions, the ultimate fate of the impact hypothesis may be less important than what the debate has revealed about the complexity of the late Pleistocene extinction event. Whether or not a cosmic impact contributed to the Younger Dryas, the event itself was real. A dramatic, rapid cooling that interrupted the post-glacial warming and added a severe environmental stress to populations of megafauna that were already under pressure from the longer-term climate transition and from human hunting. The Younger Dryas is another layer in the complex stratigraphy of the mammoth's decline, another stressor added to a list that already included habitat loss, genetic deterioration, and the arrival of effective human hunters. The mammoth did not go extinct for any single reason. It went extinct because a world that had sustained it for hundreds of thousands of years changed in multiple ways simultaneously, and the combination of those changes was more than it could survive. The mammoth's extinction on the mainland was not the end of the story. It was not even the final chapter. The discovery that a population of woolly mammoths survived on Wrangel Island in the Russian Arctic until approximately 4,000 years ago is one of the most remarkable facts in the entire history of the Pleistocene extinctions. Wrangel Island is a remote Arctic island roughly the size of the United States state of Connecticut, located in the East Siberian Sea north of the Siberian mainland, separated from the coast by approximately 140 kilometers of ocean. It became an island approximately 10,000 years ago, when rising sea levels following the end of the Ice Age separated it from the mainland Siberian coast. The mammoth population that was already living on what would become Wrangel Island was cut off by the rising sea and became isolated from the mainland population. And on that island, protected from human hunters by the ocean barrier and sustained by the mammoth steppe habitat that persisted on the island while it disappeared from the mainland, the mammoths survived for another 6,000 years after their mainland relatives had gone extinct. The Wrangel Island mammoths were not quite the same animals as their mainland ancestors. 6,000 years of island isolation had produced changes. The Wrangel Island mammoths were somewhat smaller than mainland mammoths, a common phenomenon in island populations known as island dwarfism. Their DNA shows the genetic signature of a small founding population and the accumulation of deleterious mutations that characterizes isolated small populations over time. Toward the end of the Wrangel Island population's existence, in the final few centuries before extinction, roughly 4,000 years ago, the genetic evidence shows an extreme loss of diversity and an accumulation of mutations in genes associated with sensory perception, neurological development, and male fertility that would have significantly compromised the animal's fitness. The date of the Wrangel Island mammoth's final extinction, approximately 4,000 years ago, coincides with the period when the island first shows evidence of human occupation. Whether the arrival of humans was the proximate cause of the Wrangel Island extinction, completing the same process that had eliminated the mainland mammoths earlier, or whether the population was already so genetically compromised that it would have gone extinct regardless, is a question that the evidence does not definitively answer. What it does suggest is that the final extinction of the woolly mammoth, wherever it occurred, was associated with human presence, that the species managed to persist in the places and times from which humans were absent and disappeared in association with human arrival. The Wrangel Island mammoths were living 4,000 years ago, at a time when the Egyptian pyramids were already standing, when the Bronze Age was well advanced in Europe and the Near East. While the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom were governing Egypt and the Minoans were building their palace at Knossos, a small population of woolly mammoths was living on a remote Arctic island, gradually going extinct, completely unknown to any human civilization. That temporal overlap is one of the most striking facts revealed by the Wrangel Island dating, a reminder that the age of the mammoth was not as remote as we tend to assume, and that the extinction of the species falls within the period historians call antiquity rather than the deep prehistoric past. The Wrangel Island mammoths also provide a model for understanding how small isolated populations respond to the combination of genetic stress and environmental pressure. The genetic deterioration visible in the final Wrangel Island specimens, the loss of function mutations in genes associated with sensory systems, neurological development, and male fertility, is the predictable consequence of a small population accumulating harmful mutations that natural selection cannot efficiently purge because the population is too small. Similar genetic deterioration has been documented in modern isolated populations of large mammals, in island populations of bears, in isolated populations of wolves, in the remnant populations of many endangered species that have been reduced to small numbers by habitat loss and hunting. The Wrangel Island mammoths are, in this sense, a fossil model for what is happening to many of today's most endangered species, a demonstration, preserved in the permafrost, of the inevitable genetic consequences of small population size. The Wrangel Island story has a final ironic twist that illuminates the broader pattern of the megafaunal extinctions. The mammoths that survived on Wrangel Island did so because the island was separated from the mainland by ocean, a natural barrier that kept human hunters away for thousands of years while the mainland mammoths were disappearing. When the barrier was finally crossed, around 4,000 years ago, the mammoths disappeared. The pattern is identical to what happened in Madagascar, in New Zealand, in Hawaii, and in dozens of other island groups across the world. Megafauna survive on islands until humans arrive, and then they disappear. The ocean that protected the Wrangel Island mammoths was the same ocean that protected the moa in New Zealand, the elephant bird in Madagascar, the giant tortoise in the Galapagos, until the ocean was crossed and the protection it offered was gone. The island refugia of the world are the clearest natural experiment available for testing the relationship between human arrival and megafaunal extinction, and they consistently show the same result. The question of whether the woolly mammoth could be brought back from extinction, whether the preserved DNA in the frozen specimens of Siberia contains enough information to reconstruct a living mammoth, has moved, in the past decade, from the realm of science fiction into the realm of active research, and it raises questions about the megafaunal extinctions that go beyond the purely historical. The scientific foundation for mammoth de-extinction was laid by the sequencing of the woolly mammoth genome, first completed at a high level of coverage in 2015. The genome sequenced from Wrangel Island specimens is remarkably well preserved, better than most ancient DNA from comparable time periods, and it has allowed researchers to identify the specific genetic variants that distinguish the woolly mammoth from its closest living relative, the Asian elephant. The two species share approximately 99.6% of their genome. They are approximately as closely related as modern humans and chimpanzees, but the small fraction of their genome that differs contains the adaptations that made the mammoth adapted to the Arctic cold. The fur, the cold-adapted hemoglobin, the fat deposition patterns, the metabolic adaptations to extreme cold. The biotechnology company Colossal Biosciences, founded in 2021 with significant venture capital funding, has announced the goal of producing a mammoth-like animal, a cold-adapted Asian elephant with key mammoth traits introduced through CRISPR gene editing, within this decade. The project involves editing the genome of Asian elephant cells to introduce mammoth-specific variants at the most important adaptive loci, growing those cells into embryos, and ultimately producing living animals that possess the key characteristics of the woolly mammoth, even if their genome is not identical to it. The scientific challenges are formidable. The gestation period of elephants is 22 months. There is no established method for artificial gestation in elephants, and the effects of introducing mammoth-specific variants into an otherwise Asian elephant genome are not fully predictable. The ethical questions raised by the de-extinction project are as significant as the scientific ones. If a mammoth-like animal is produced, where will it live? The mammoth steppe habitat that the original mammoths inhabited no longer exists at scale, though some researchers, working on the Pleistocene Park project in Siberia, argue that large herbivores can recreate something like the mammoth steppe by trampling the snow cover and allowing the ground to freeze more deeply, which could slow the melting of the Siberian permafrost that is occurring with Arctic warming. Whether a de-extinct mammoth would actually serve that ecological function, whether it would behave like a wild mammoth rather than a captive animal, is unknown. The relationship between a genetically modified Asian elephant and the ecological role of the Pleistocene woolly mammoth involves too many unknowns to predict with confidence. But the conversation about de-extinction has at least forced a more precise engagement with why the mammoth went extinct in the first place, and with what role, if any, humanity might have in addressing the consequences of that extinction. The de-extinction debate also raises questions about resource allocation and conservation priorities. The funding and scientific talent devoted to mammoth de-extinction is substantial, and critics have argued that it would be better spent on preventing the extinction of currently endangered species, the Asian elephant itself, the 2 species of African elephant, the remaining rhinoceros species, rather than on the more speculative project of restoring an extinct one. The de-extinction advocates respond that the 2 goals are not in competition, that the genetic and reproductive technologies developed for de-extinction have direct applications to conservation of living endangered species, and that the mammoth's cultural power as a symbol could generate public enthusiasm and funding for conservation more broadly. That debate is not purely scientific, but involves value judgments about priorities and risks that no scientific analysis can resolve. What is clear is that the mammoth, in death as in life, continues to shape the world around it, now not through its ecological role but through its cultural and scientific significance, as a symbol of what has been lost and what might, perhaps, be recovered. The de-extinction debate also raises questions about resource allocation and conservation priorities that are not purely scientific. The funding and scientific talent devoted to mammoth de-extinction is substantial, and critics have argued that it would be better spent on preventing the extinction of currently endangered species, the Asian elephant itself, the 2 species of African elephant, the remaining rhinoceros species, rather than on the much more speculative project of restoring an extinct one. The de-extinction advocates respond that the 2 goals are not necessarily in competition, that the genetic and reproductive technologies developed for de-extinction have direct applications to the conservation of living endangered species, and that the mammoth is a uniquely powerful cultural symbol whose potential restoration could generate public enthusiasm and funding for conservation more broadly. That debate is not purely scientific, but involves value judgments about priorities and risks that no scientific analysis can resolve on its own. What is clear is that the mammoth, in death as in life, continues to be a species that shapes the world around it, now not through its ecological role but through its cultural and scientific significance, as a symbol of what has been lost and what might, perhaps, be recovered. The broader pattern of the Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions, the disappearance not just of the mammoth but of dozens of other large animal species across multiple continents, raises questions about humanity's role in the natural world that are as relevant today as they were 40,000 years ago. The late Quaternary extinction event, as it is formally known, eliminated approximately 100 genera of large mammals worldwide between approximately 50,000 and 10,000 years ago. The losses were not uniform across the globe. Australia lost approximately 90% of its megafauna, North America lost approximately 70%, South America lost approximately 80%, Eurasia lost approximately 35%, and Africa, where large mammals had co-evolved with hominid hunters for millions of years, lost less than 20%. That pattern, with the greatest losses in the regions that had no previous experience of bipedal hunters, and the smallest losses in Africa where the megafauna had been shaped by a long coevolutionary history with human ancestors, is precisely what the overkill hypothesis predicts, and it is one of the strongest pieces of evidence in its favor. Africa's relative escape from the Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions is particularly instructive. The African megafauna, elephants, rhinoceroses, hippopotamuses, giraffes, zebras, the great apes, includes many species that in other contexts would be considered highly vulnerable to human hunting. Large, slow-reproducing animals with low reproductive rates that cannot sustain heavy predation pressure. The reason they survived while comparable species on other continents did not is almost certainly that they had been exposed to human hunters for long enough to develop the behavioral wariness that makes them difficult to hunt. The African megafauna had hundreds of thousands of years to learn to fear humans before humans developed the weapons technology that made them truly dangerous. The megafauna of the Americas, Australia, and the Pacific Islands had no such preparation. They encountered fully modern humans for the first time, with no evolutionary history of wariness, and the results were catastrophic. That pattern has a direct contemporary relevance. The species that are most vulnerable to human pressure today are those that have had least exposure to it. Animals in remote regions that are newly accessible due to logging roads and infrastructure development, animals on islands that are newly connected to the mainland by bridges or causeways, animals in habitats that are newly disrupted by the expansion of agriculture. The history of the Pleistocene extinctions is, in this sense, a history that has not ended. It is a process that continues today, at a faster rate and on a larger scale than at any time since the end of the Pleistocene, and the parallel with the dynamics of the first great extinction event is uncomfortably close. The current extinction crisis, the sixth mass extinction, as it has been called by biologists who study the rate and scale of species loss, is occurring at a rate estimated to be between 101,000 times the background extinction rate of the geological record. The Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions, as dramatic as they were, eliminated perhaps 100 genera of large mammals over a period of tens of thousands of years. The current extinction event is eliminating species across all taxonomic groups: plants, invertebrates, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, at rates that may exceed anything in the fossil record outside of the 5 previous mass extinctions. The specific drivers are different from those of the Pleistocene event. Habitat loss from agriculture and urbanization is now the dominant driver, followed by climate change, invasive species, pollution, and direct exploitation, but the underlying dynamic is the same. A species with unprecedented technological power expanding rapidly across the globe, transforming every habitat it enters, and eliminating species that have not had time to develop behavioral or evolutionary adaptations to the new conditions. The connection between the Pleistocene extinctions and the current crisis is not merely analogical. Many of the species that are most threatened today are the direct ecological successors of the Pleistocene megafauna, the elephants, rhinoceroses, and hippopotamuses of Africa, the great apes of the tropical forests, the large predators of every continent. These species have already survived one episode of intensive human pressure, the Pleistocene event, and their survival reflects either the long coevolutionary history with human hunters that gave them the behavioral wariness that protected them, or the geographic remoteness that kept them beyond the reach of the first wave of human expansion. Both of those protective factors are now being eroded. The behavioral wariness that protected African elephants from Pleistocene hunters provides little protection against automatic rifles and the ivory trade, and the geographic remoteness that protected the great apes of the Congo Basin is being eliminated by logging roads and agricultural expansion. The second wave of the human-driven megafaunal extinction is underway, and its eventual scale will depend on choices that are being made now. The mammoth's ecological role in the Pleistocene, and the consequences of its removal from the ecosystem, is a dimension of the extinction story that is only recently being fully appreciated, and it has direct implications for the science of conservation and restoration ecology. Large herbivores are keystone species in most terrestrial ecosystems, animals whose feeding, trampling, and movement have effects on the landscape that are disproportionate to their numbers. The African elephant is the classic example. Elephant populations determine whether a savanna is forested or open by browsing young trees and preventing forest encroachment into grassland. Remove the elephants, and the savanna converts to dense woodland within decades. The woolly mammoth played a comparable role in the mammoth steppe. Its feeding maintained the open grassland structure of the ecosystem, its trampling incorporated organic material into the soil, and its movement redistributed nutrients across the landscape. When the mammoth disappeared, the mammoth steppe lost its primary engineer. The consequences of the mammoth's disappearance have been studied by the Russian ecologist Sergei Zimov, who has been running the Pleistocene Park experiment in the Kolyma lowlands of Siberia since 1996. Zimov has been introducing large herbivores, horses, bison, reindeer, musk oxen, and other grazers, to a fenced area of tundra, with the hypothesis that the presence of large herbivores will transform the tundra back toward a grassland ecosystem similar to the mammoth steppe. The early results of the experiment have been striking. Areas with large herbivore populations show significantly more grasses and forbs and significantly less moss and shrub tundra than adjacent unmanaged areas, confirming that the presence of large grazers does indeed shift the ecosystem toward the open grassland structure that characterized the mammoth steppe. The relevance of these findings to climate change is significant. The Siberian permafrost contains enormous quantities of organic carbon. Estimates suggest it holds approximately twice as much carbon as the current atmosphere, and the melting of that permafrost with Arctic warming could release vast quantities of carbon dioxide and methane, accelerating climate change in a runaway feedback loop. Zimov's research suggests that the presence of large herbivores, by trampling the snow in winter and allowing deeper freezing of the soil, significantly reduces the rate of permafrost thaw. A landscape with a large herbivore community of the Pleistocene would, according to this model, be significantly more resistant to permafrost melting than the current tundra landscape. The extinction of the mammoth and the other megaherbivores of the Pleistocene may therefore have contributed to an acceleration of permafrost melting that continues today, a legacy of the ancient extinction that operates in the present through the changed dynamics of the Arctic ecosystem. The rewilding science that has emerged from studying the ecological consequences of the Pleistocene extinctions raises the possibility that restoring large herbivores could reverse some of the changes that followed the original extinctions. The Pleistocene Park experiment in Siberia, run by Sergei Zimov and his son Nikita, has demonstrated that the presence of large grazers does transform tundra vegetation toward something more resembling the mammoth steppe, with more grasses and forbs and less of the mossy, waterlogged tundra that currently dominates the Siberian landscape. The mechanism involves the trampling of snow in winter, removing the insulating layer and allowing deeper freezing of the permafrost, reducing the rate of methane release that accompanies permafrost thaw. The broader rewilding movement draws on these lessons directly. Trophic rewilding, reintroducing large predators and herbivores to restore ecological processes that their absence has disrupted, has gained significant scientific and public support. Projects to reintroduce wolves to Europe and North America, to restore bison to the American Great Plains, to return lynx to British forests, all draw on the understanding that the removal of large animals has cascading effects on the ecosystems from which they were removed. The Pleistocene extinctions were the first and most dramatic episode of this kind of ecological simplification, and the rewilding movement is, in part, an attempt to walk back toward the richer world that existed before the megafauna disappeared. The Pleistocene Park experiment also illustrates the difference between what can be shown at small scale and what would be required to have meaningful impact at scale. The fenced reserve covers about 20 square kilometers. The Siberian permafrost zone covers more than 10 million square kilometers. Restoring grazing communities across that entire landscape would require numbers of animals that do not currently exist, governance frameworks across multiple countries, and sustained political commitment that has not yet been mobilized. The science is real and significant. The gap between the science and the application is enormous. Whether that gap can be crossed, whether the legacy of the mammoth's extinction can be partly addressed through restoring the ecological processes it once sustained, are questions that will be answered not by paleontologists but by the societies that choose what kind of world they want to maintain. The question of what the mammoth's world was actually like, not as a reconstruction from fossils and frozen specimens, but as a lived environment, a place inhabited by creatures whose behavior and social structure we can only partially infer from indirect evidence, is one that the preserved specimens have opened in ways that no other category of paleontological evidence can match. The social behavior of woolly mammoths was almost certainly similar to that of modern elephants, their closest living relatives. Modern elephants live in complex matriarchal social groups, with adult females and their offspring forming the core social unit, adult males living in bachelor herds or in solitary ranges, and a sophisticated communication system that includes vocalizations at frequencies below the range of human hearing, tactile communication, and chemical signaling through secretions from temporal glands on the sides of the head. There is every reason to believe that woolly mammoths had a comparable social organization. The anatomy of the temporal region of the skull suggests temporal gland secretion, and the size and complexity of the mammoth brain is consistent with the cognitive demands of complex social behavior. Mammoths probably mourned their dead, remembered individual relationships over long periods, and passed knowledge of migration routes and food sources from older females to younger group members through social learning. The extinction of the mammoth was therefore not simply the elimination of a species but the dissolution of a social culture, the disappearance of knowledge and tradition that had been accumulated and transmitted over generations. The loss of that social knowledge may have played a direct role in the extinction itself. Modern elephant populations that have been decimated by poaching, where the oldest females, the matriarchs who carry the greatest store of geographic and social knowledge, have been selectively targeted because they carry the largest tusks, show measurably impaired ability to respond to environmental challenges. Studies of elephant populations in areas heavily affected by ivory poaching have found that herds led by younger, less experienced females travel less efficiently, make poorer decisions during droughts, and show higher rates of stress and conflict than herds with experienced matriarchal leadership. The loss of the oldest and most knowledgeable individuals cascades through the social structure of the herd in ways that reduce the fitness of the entire group, not just the individuals directly affected. Apply that dynamic to the mammoth populations of the late Pleistocene, and a sobering picture emerges. The first targets of human hunters would have been the largest individuals, the ones with the most impressive tusks, the most meat. Those would also have been the oldest individuals, the matriarchs who carried the knowledge accumulated over decades of life on the mammoth steppe. As those animals were removed from the population, the remaining herds would have been led by younger, less experienced females whose geographic and social knowledge was more limited. Their ability to find food and water in a landscape that was changing rapidly would have been compromised. Their ability to navigate to the high-quality summer pastures that the mammoths depended on for their annual cycle of fattening would have been reduced. And the quality of the social learning environment for calves, the transmission of knowledge about the landscape from experienced elders to young animals, would have deteriorated with each generation. The extinction of the mammoth may have been, in part, a self-reinforcing process in which the removal of the most experienced individuals degraded the social and cognitive capacity of the surviving population to cope with environmental challenges, accelerating the decline that the removal of those individuals had initiated. The mammoth's relationship with the first human hunters is one that the cave art of Western Europe illuminates in a striking way. The cave paintings of Chauvet, Lascaux, and other Paleolithic sites include images of woolly mammoths that are so specific and so naturalistic that they could only have been made by people who had observed living mammoths closely. The paintings show the characteristic domed head, the sloping back, the long curved tusks, the dense hair, details that match the anatomy of the frozen specimens with remarkable precision. The people who made these paintings lived in a world in which mammoths were a real presence, animals that shaped the landscape, that could be encountered in the wild, that were hunted and feared and perhaps respected in ways that we can only dimly imagine. Those painters are our ancestors. The world they lived in was ours, displaced by 40,000 years and transformed by the long consequences of the choices that were made in it. The cave art also suggests a cognitive relationship between the Paleolithic hunters and the animals they hunted that goes beyond simple predator and prey. The paintings of Chauvet and Lascaux are not simple hunting records. They are images created with evident aesthetic intention, with attention to composition, perspective, and the rendering of movement and mass. The mammoths are specific, each one captured in a particular pose or moment. Not generic symbols but individual observations, made by people who had spent long hours watching living animals. Whatever the paintings meant to those who made them, they reflect a relationship with the animals that is intimate and in some sense reverential. The Paleolithic hunters knew the mammoth. They had watched it live. They painted it on cave walls by firelight, in chambers deep underground where no practical purpose is obvious. The science of the Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions has been transformed in the past 2 decades by the application of ancient DNA analysis, and the picture that is emerging is one of remarkable complexity, far more nuanced than the simple narratives of climate change or human overkill that dominated the earlier literature. The ancient DNA revolution in paleontology began in earnest in the 1990s, when improved methods for extracting and sequencing degraded DNA from ancient specimens made it possible to recover genetic information from bones and teeth that were tens of thousands of years old. The woolly mammoth was among the first extinct species to have its genetic material recovered. A landmark 1994 paper reported the recovery of mammoth mitochondrial DNA from a specimen preserved in permafrost, and the quality and quantity of genetic information available from mammoth specimens has increased dramatically with each generation of sequencing technology. By the mid-2010s, complete mammoth genomes were being sequenced from multiple specimens, allowing population genetic analyses of a sophistication that was previously reserved for living species. Those analyses have revealed that the woolly mammoth was not a single undifferentiated species, but a collection of genetically distinct populations that had been isolated from each other during glacial periods, had mixed during interglacials, and had diverged and converged in a pattern of complex population history spanning hundreds of thousands of years. The European mammoth populations, the Siberian populations, and the North American populations show distinct genetic signatures that reflect their long periods of isolation and the different selective pressures of their different environments. The Wrangel Island population, isolated for 6,000 years, shows the most extreme differentiation of all, a small founding population whose genome has been shaped by inbreeding and by the accumulation of harmful mutations in a way that is documented with unprecedented clarity in the ancient DNA record. The ancient DNA work has also provided crucial information about the timing of population crashes and recoveries in relation to the environmental and human factors that have been proposed as causes of the extinctions. The genetic data are consistent with the combination hypothesis that climate change weakened mammoth populations and human hunting delivered the final blow, but they are not consistent with a simple sequential narrative in which one factor acted and then the other. The interactions were more dynamic, more complex, and more contingent than any simple model can capture. Different populations declined at different times, in different ways, under the influence of different combinations of pressures. The extinction of the woolly mammoth was not a single event but a process, prolonged, uneven, driven by the interaction of global climate change with the local ecology of specific populations in specific landscapes, and ultimately tipped into final collapse by the pressure of human hunting in some regions and genetic deterioration in others. The ancient DNA work has also revealed something surprising about the relationship between mammoths and the modern world. mammoth DNA is not entirely gone from the living biosphere. The Asian elephant, the mammoth's closest living relative, carries within its genome traces of ancient gene flow from woolly mammoths, sequences that were introduced into the Asian elephant lineage during periods of geographic overlap in the Pleistocene, when the two species interbred in areas where their ranges met. Those mammoth-derived sequences are still present in modern Asian elephant populations, a genetic fossil of the contact between the two lineages tens of thousands of years ago. The mammoth is extinct, but some fragments of its genetic legacy persist in the genomes of its living relatives, preserved not in the permafrost but in the living cells of the animals that walk the forests of South and Southeast Asia today. The transformation of paleontology by ancient DNA analysis is still accelerating. New techniques for recovering and sequencing increasingly degraded DNA are pushing the boundaries of how far back in time genetic information can be recovered from biological remains. Recent work has recovered usable DNA from specimens over 1 million years old, a Siberian mammoth that predates the woolly mammoth and represents an earlier stage in the evolution of the mammoth lineage. That specimen's genome has allowed the first direct comparison of the genomes of successive mammoth species, revealing the specific genetic changes associated with the evolution of the woolly mammoth's cold adaptations from its more temperate ancestors. The genetic history of the mammoth lineage, spanning millions of years, multiple species, multiple continents, and ultimately ending with the death of the last Wrangel Island individual approximately 4,000 years ago, is being reconstructed in a detail that would have seemed impossible a decade ago. Each new specimen, each new genome sequence, adds resolution to a picture that is becoming richer and more complex with every year of research. There is a question that the extinction of the woolly mammoth raises that goes beyond the scientific, a question about responsibility, about the relationship between humanity and the natural world, and about what obligations, if any, the past creates for the present. The evidence that human hunters played a significant role in the Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions does not, of course, implicate any specific individual or group in a moral failing. The hunters who followed mammoth herds across the Siberian steppe or the North American plains were doing what hunters do, pursuing the most effective prey available with the best tools they had. They had no concept of extinction as a possibility, no understanding of population biology, no way of knowing that the animals they were hunting were members of a population that was already under stress from climate change and genetic deterioration. They were people doing their best in a difficult world, and the extinction that resulted from their actions was an unintended consequence of activities that were entirely rational from their perspective. But the parallel with the present is unavoidable. We are in the middle of a sixth mass extinction event, a wave of species loss that is primarily driven by human activity, that is proceeding at rates estimated to be 100 to 1,000 times the background extinction rate, and that is eliminating species with the same combination of habitat loss, climate change, and direct exploitation that drove the Pleistocene extinctions. The mechanisms are the same. The time scale is compressed. And unlike the Paleolithic hunters who drove the mammoth toward extinction without any awareness of what they were doing, we have detailed knowledge of the process. We can measure the rates, identify the causes, model the consequences, and in principle take actions to slow or reverse the losses. The mammoth story is one that human beings have been telling in different forms for thousands of years. In the cave paintings that preserved the image of a living animal long after the animal itself was gone, in the myths and traditions of the peoples who lived alongside the last mammoths and may have preserved memories of their disappearance, in the scientific literature that has accumulated over the past century as researchers have tried to understand what happened and why. It is a story that is still being told, still being revised as new evidence emerges from the permafrost and the ancient DNA laboratories, still generating debate among scientists who approach the same evidence from different perspectives and reach different conclusions. The mammoth has not finished teaching us. It is still, in its frozen silence, saying something about the world, about the conditions in which large animals can survive, about the pressures that can eliminate even the most successful and widespread species, about the relationship between climate and habitat and predation and genetics that determines whether a population lives or dies. We are still learning to listen. The frozen mammoths of Siberia are, in this sense, more than just scientific specimens. They are evidence, preserved in ice for tens of thousands of years, waiting to be read by a civilization with the tools to interpret them, of what the world has already lost and of how that loss happened. The combination of climate stress and human predation that eliminated the mammoth is not a historical curiosity. It is a pattern that repeats, at different scales and in different forms, throughout the human relationship with the natural world. The mammoth story is not finished. It is still being told, in the continuing losses of the current extinction crisis, by a species that knows better now than the Paleolithic hunters did, and that is choosing, in many cases, to act no differently. The frozen bodies in the Siberian permafrost are, in the most literal sense, the mammoth's last message to the world. They contain within them, in their proteins, their DNA, their stomach contents, their bone chemistry, an extraordinary quantity of information about the world as it was, about the animals that lived in it, and about the circumstances in which they died. That information is still being extracted, still being analyzed, still yielding new insights about the Pleistocene world and the process of its transformation. Every new mammoth specimen, every new genome sequence, every new stable isotope analysis adds to the picture. The mammoths are still speaking, in the language of biochemistry and genetics, to anyone with the tools to listen. What they are saying, translated into the language of ecology and conservation biology, is something like this: the world that sustained us was rich and complex and productive, shaped by the interaction of climate and large animals in ways that are only now being understood. We were part of a system, not just inhabitants of a landscape but architects of it, shaping the vegetation, the soil, the hydrology, the carbon cycle of the northern hemisphere through our feeding and our movement. When we went, the system changed. The mammoth steppe became the tundra. The permafrost began to warm. The carbon that had been locked in the frozen ground began, slowly, to release. The consequences of our disappearance are still unfolding, in the warming Arctic, in the thawing permafrost, in the simplified ecosystems that have replaced the complex megafaunal communities of the Pleistocene. The mammoth's extinction is not ancient history. It is the backstory of the present. If this documentary kept you company tonight, subscribe to the channel. There are more extinctions worth mourning, more moments when the world changed and left evidence in the ice and the rock and the frozen ground of what it used to be. A new documentary every week, always in the hours designed for rest, always going further than you expect.